three techniques. And I was thinking about the first name. I was like, will I make it sound nicer? But no, fight better. So there's a technique called fighting better, and you need to learn how to fight better in order to co-create great relationships. Then there's a piece around understanding how our cognitive bias influences our interactions with others. And then there's a piece around our psychological perspectives. So let's start with fighting better. Okay, so there's 3 steps to fighting better. I'm going to give you an example of a fight because I think it works really well. And this actually isn't something I fight over, but it's something that I've heard when I work with individuals trying to improve their relationships repeatedly. Okay, so you didn't put the bins out. Okay, so one partner says to the other partner, you didn't put the bins out, you don't care about me, you never put the bins out. I always have to remind you, you're just so distracted with X, Y, and Z. Now, if that doesn't relate to you, if you can't find a kind of slight relationship to that on another topic, I want you to think of another pet peeve that someone might have that's in your life that they constantly bring up that drives you nuts, because it will help you work through fighting better with me. I'm going to use the bin example, okay? So a frustrated partner who feels unheard, not listened to, the bins aren't being put out, they constantly have to nag, the other partner is distracted, annoyed that they're being nagged, and the fight continues. Okay, so step 1 is know what happens to you in conflict. Okay, so most of the time when we get into conflict, we want to look at the other person and what they're doing wrong, what they shouldn't have done, what they should have done, what you wish they did. But what we don't do as easily is know what's happening for us. So when we're in a fight, we don't as easily come into ourselves and say, okay, how am I reacting to this conflict? What is happening within me that is adding to the fight? So the things that happen to us are fight. So we have a defensiveness. Well, I can't remember to put out the bins all the time. We have flight, which is, oh, I'll do it next time, and getting out of the room. And we have freeze. I can't think. I just can't answer. I don't know what to say. When you think about getting into a fight with somebody, which one of these do you think you do? Do you think you become defensive and fight with them? Do you think you try to avoid the argument and get out of it? Or do you think you freeze and kind of lose sense of how to respond? So lots of I don't knows, I can't think, I've gone blank, that type of thinking. The first thing to know is what's happening to you. So you're really good already at figuring that out, okay? And I want to say this, as a person who teaches this and coaches people on this, I still have to count to 10 and say, before you go and give out to them about everything they've done, what's happening in you, because I'm still caught in it. This knowing better doesn't actually result in doing better when it happens in our nervous system. But what can happen as we move through this is a step you can do to help your nervous system. The next step is to understand their complaints as requests for unmet needs. Now, this one was life-changing for me when I figured this one out. When someone complains to you, they're actually telling you indirectly that they have an unmet need, that they may not know they have, they may not know how to ask you, or they may be really uncomfortable with asking you to meet that need. And I'm going to use the bins as an example, okay? So in the case where this person was giving out to their partner for not putting out the bins, when we actually delved into it, what this person actually wanted wasn't the bins to be put out, but they didn't know how to say to their partner, I don't feel cared for in this relationship. I don't feel that my needs matter to you, and I don't know how to have that conversation. And so when people come to us and complain about something, our defenses are going to kick in like we've just discussed. But if we can hold ourselves and we can listen to the complaints and look for the unmet needs, the requests that they're not asking us for, then we're more likely to move through that argument and create resolution. But a lot of the times what we do is get into a fight about the thing. So an example would be, well, you can't expect me to put out the bins all the time. And maybe I'd put out the bins if you stopped nagging me all the time. And what's your obsession with the bins anyway? And then the fight becomes about the bins rather than the unmet needs that the complainer actually has. So if you can use this when you're finding your defenses kicking up, and you can remind yourself that somebody being critical or complaining is actually trying to communicate an unmet need. Third part is to regulate yourself. So based on polyvagal theory, we have a nervous system, and when we feel threatened, our nervous system does its job: fight, flight, freeze. And if we live in any one of those states for too long, it has quite a strong impact on our ability to relate, but also on our anxiety, on our ability to feel well in ourselves. So what we need to do when we're in conflict with somebody is we need to reassure ourselves it will be okay. That's the starting point. It will be okay. Our nervous system is going to kick in to protect us, which isn't going to be saying it will be okay. It's going to be saying it won't be okay. They never listen to you. They always do this. You need to get out, or you need to put them right, or don't say anything in case they find another flaw. So you have to start by reminding yourself it will be okay, because it starts to very gently regulate your system. You also need to remind yourself why you want this conversation to work out. And what I mean by that is, my partner, and they gave me permission to tell you, when we fight, she reminds herself, I love her. Just remember that you love her, because otherwise you're going to kill her. And so she repeatedly reminds me that she wants this conversation to work out where we're both content, because if she doesn't remind herself, she'll kill me because she's fed up of whatever we're arguing about. Okay, so you have to remind yourself why this conversation is important to resolve, rather than the initial reaction, which is either to fight, to get away from it, or not to engage with it, which is the freeze. You need to remind yourself that your defenses will hijack you to protect you, but in the long term cause harm. So for anyone that watches TikTok, they do these really quick clips where they tell you random things. And there's this joke about toxic traits, right? So they're joking about their most toxic trait. And I saw one the other day where this person said, my most toxic trait is I want to end the whole relationship when they make one mistake, because I feel so hurt. I think the whole relationship is pointless. And that's a prime example of one of the defenses that can kick in. There's other defenses, which is why bother? And then there's other defenses, which is I don't know what's wrong with them. I don't know. And it's this avoidance altogether. So what we have to do is we have to know what our defense reaction will be. We then have to see the complaints or the complaining as communicating unmet needs. And then we need to regulate ourselves so that we can stay in the relationship for this moment to have this conversation. And this happens at work too. You might have a manager who drives you nuts, who seems really critical. You get really defensive. You start being defensive to them because you're not thinking about what they're really asking you behind their complaints. So now you're defending yourself and they're defending themselves. And then you're getting more worked up. And very slowly you're dissolving positive parts of that relationship. And research has shown we need 5 positives to 1 negative in order to stay positive about a relationship. So we need 5 positive interactions to 1 negative interaction to feel good about the relationship. And so these 3 steps will help you stay present long enough to actually resolve the relationship, rather than to pause it for it to re-emerge at another time. The second one is cognitive bias. So if you're dating someone and you want the relationship to work, you're going to create a narrative around their behavior that reassures you that the relationship will work. And you're going to look for proof that confirms that you're right. So one of the things we all do naturally is have cognitive bias. And if we can't catch that, we're going to start trapping other people in our stories about them. So for example, if you've decided that somebody isn't going to care for you very much in a relationship, then your cognitive bias is going to look for evidence that that's true. And it's going to ignore evidence that it's not true, which means that when you have a narrative about you, your partner, your family, your co-workers, what tends to happen is we look for proof that it's true. And then it does become true to us. We experience it that way because that's what we're actually focused on. So what can you do about it? So the first thing is acknowledge your narrative. So we all have narratives. We all have a narrative about who we are. We all have a narrative about the people in our lives, about our families, about our colleagues, about our co-workers. We can examine those and how that might be impacting the way we relate to people. The second thing we can do is be curious about the other person's perspective. So when you're trying to untangle a narrative you have about a person, what tends to be really helpful is to actually think about how they might be seeing the situation and what they may be doing in order to be okay or safe or protected, just like you. And then the third thing that we need to do is we need to discern our conclusions. So we need to be willing to not only be wrong, but to look for evidence that we're wrong. And we need to be willing to say that while I think this and they think that, I may not be 100% right here. They may not be 100% right. There may be a space that we share, but the two people can influence the relationship. So one of the things that people can get really caught on this one is if you're a right fighter. So if you're someone who likes to fight and likes to be right at the end of the fight, that means that you won't really be examining your narrative. You won't really be curious about the other person's perspective, only to knock it down. And you won't really look at how you and the other person can co-create a narrative about your relationship, because you'll be busy trying to dominate that narrative because of your bias. And the last but not least is bids. So I'm going to give you a little piece around what bids are. So bids are any moment where one human reaches out to another. When someone asks you for a coffee, when someone shows you something on their phone, when somebody texts you, when somebody asks if you need something from across the room, when somebody walks with you somewhere, says, can I walk with you there? Bids are these really subtle moments. We tend to know big bids, like if you're being chatted up at a bar, that's quite a risky bid, right? And we tend to know that they're bids. But in relationships that are quite established, and this can be professional relationships, romantic relationships, family relationships, we can sometimes not see a bid for a bid. And we do see this happen in relationships that are struggling. And an example would be at work. If you're asking your manager, do they want to grab a tea or coffee, or you're popping them an email and they don't reply, these are examples of bids being dropped, and that can really harm trust in a relationship. And so when we're trying to create great relationships, we need to think about the contact that we have with somebody and when they're bidding into that shared space in the Venn diagram. What are the bids that they make, even if you might be missing them? Because if you could understand those bids, you'd be able to respond in kind. So I can say to my buddy, I really don't like soccer. I won't go on that. Do you want to go for a walk on Friday instead? So you can shift a bid, but you can still mirror it back so that you're showing that you still have care towards a person and that they're important. One of the things that can be really hard to watch is when children bid to their parents. So when a child is saying, Mom, look what I did, or Dad, look what I did, and they're on their phones, they're like, oh yeah, that's great. And they're still on their phones. That's a lost bid for connection. And children are bidding all the time, but what children learn to do is to stop bidding when they're not responded to, because it actually hurts. And so it's really important to think about bids beyond the topic. You might say they're just showing me a picture, it doesn't matter. Or they're showing me something for the 100th time, it doesn't matter. But it's not the topic that's actually important in a bid. It's the bid. It's the fact that somebody was reaching out to create connection. They have this additional meaning, which is, do you see me? Do you like me? Do I matter? Am I important? And sometimes behind bids, unconsciously, there's a deeper question, which are these 4 questions. Do you see me? Do you like me? Do I matter? Am I important? But underneath bids, what we're really asking for is to see this mirrored back to us, that somebody sees us, that they like us, that we matter, that we're important. And when bids are received well, even if the content is declined, you will see that relationships really strive because people fundamentally feel seen, liked/loved. They feel like they matter and they know that they're important to that person. And all of that can come from a text, a coffee, showing you something, a request, and even a complaint. So even a complaint can be a bid, because like we spoke about earlier, it can be a bid for unmet needs that maybe the person still themselves haven't brought understanding to. And so here are open relating techniques. Fight better, work with your cognitive bias, practice and notice your bids. So what gets in the way of relating? Fear. The minute fear kicks in, our defenses kicks in, underdeveloped relating skills can kick in. So if you weren't exposed to as many different types of relating growing up or in your teen years, you may have underdeveloped relating skills. You may have a lack of boundaries, so it might make it really hard to share space because you might actually put people off. Low self-esteem, so sometimes we don't trust or believe that people are actually giving us bids or are actually interested in getting to know us. Trauma, so trauma shows up in lots of ways in relationships and brings a lot of challenges to relationships. I'd also say that if there's trauma in your history, trauma can also bring fruits to really great relationships, because the work that you do to support yourself through trauma can actually be really beneficial to relationships. Fear of intimacy, so this fear of really being seen as yourself or being viewed in your flaws can really reduce your ability to create great relationships. And both anxiety and depressing, they can both impact your ability to relate, because the anxiety has you distracted by fears and concerns, and the depressing can have you distracted by hopelessness. And so all of those things can make relating a little bit more challenging